Hi everybody, my name is Brigitte Alepin and I am a tax specialist, and I am here with my colleague Louise Otis. Louise is an international judge and a mediator. Together we are representing TaxCOOP, a Canadian NGO founded by Madame Otis, myself and my colleague Linda Schlip, who is in Montreal with our Canadian team, and I'm sure they're watching us live. So, what is TaxCOOP exactly? TaxCOOP is a Canadian NGO that focuses on tax competition and tax cooperation. So, it all started in 2005 when I was at Harvard, and I had a contract with Harvard on how to adapt our tax system to globalization. And at that time, nobody were really talking about modernization of our tax system. And I had to do this whole research on traditional tax systems. And at that time, I found out that, I realized that whatever solution we will find to adapt our tax system to globalization, we will need consensus, we will need a global rendezvous to speak about these solutions, and we will need consensus and implementation. So we will need finally a similar rendezvous than the COP25 we are here presently. So I told myself at that time that, of course, either the UN, the World Bank, or the OECD will organize that type of rendezvous, or maybe all these organizations together. And in 2014, when I realized that there were no such rendezvous, I went to CPA Quebec and I said, would you like to have this crazy dream with us and organize what would be the first COP of tax? So we did a good job since then, and we organized the first TaxCOOP in Montreal in 2015. We went to the World Bank with, thank you to Blanca Moreno-Dodson, who is here today. So we went to the World Bank and organized TaxCOOP 2016. The UN to organize TaxCOOP 2017, the OECD to organize TaxCOOP 2018, and before we come back in Montreal and organize that global summit in tax in 2020, I felt that, and not only myself, especially Judge Otis and all our team, we felt that we have to come here and dedicate ourselves to climate change. So we are here. Thank you to Martin Frick, who let us speak to you today. And so we are really organized. We are really here on a focus, on a solution mode, and we really want to suggest new solutions, new tax tools to fight climate change. So in order to really find these new solutions to fight climate change, I really dedicate myself on studying everything that happened since the last 20 years or even 30 years on climate change. And what we are suggesting today, we call it 1% for climate. So this plan, 1% for climate, is deployed in two separate programs. The first one is asking multinationals that are paying nothing or almost nothing in taxes to pay their fair share or allocate their fair share to climate change. And the second part, the second program, is more imposing a tax on the top 1% of the wealthy individual. So let me start with the first part of the program, the 1% for the multinationals. So this is really easy, and this is what is magic about this plan. It's because it's easy, and in tax it has to be easy. It has to be a story we can understand easily and explain. So the story is like this. So in 2008, in international taxation, because of the financial crisis, we started to think that we need to modernize our tax system, and we need to do a global tax reform. And in that tax reform, there's what we call, and it has been suggested only recently. It is what we call the global minimum tax, and the OECD is calling this global minimum tax, in fact, a globe. They call it the globe, so it is for the global minimum tax. And what we're saying basically is that this globe, this plan, should be a green globe, and it can be a green globe. So the globe basically is all the countries would agree, and this is not in 10 years. The agenda of the OECD is in 2020. So all the countries would agree on a global minimum tax. And we're thinking that doing this proposition or this negotiation, at the same time we should agree that maybe 1% of this global minimum tax should be allocated to climate change. And there's many reasons. It's not only one thought that we have like this. There's many reasons supporting the idea that we should, at the same time that we do the international tax reform, we should address climate change. The first reason is, first of all, climate change and international tax reform are really related together. Both of them, we need a consensus to finalize and conclude the international tax reform and the green shift to tackle climate change. So we need a global consensus, both of these initiatives. And also, both of these initiatives are really struggling with the possibility or the fact that if we go ahead, there's going to be transfer of wealth. So if we do the international tax reform, of course, there's going to be transfer of wealth between nations. And same thing with the green shift. If we go ahead with the green shift, at the end, there's going to be some sort of transfer of wealth between nations and even between industries. So again, both initiatives, they have the same issues they have to deal with. There's also a third issue that they have to deal with is global competition to attract capital. So again, international tax reform, it has to be a global consensus, because otherwise with tax competition, we will not achieve the objective of the reform. And again, with the green shift, it has to be a global consensus, because otherwise industries will move in nations where there's no green shift, or they can move to countries where there's no green shift. So that's a third reason why we think that we should try to achieve at least discuss the international tax reform and the climate change at the same time. There's also a fourth reason. Fourth reason is we saw in many countries that the climate change can be used in order to justify a tax reform. So if we go in Denmark, Germany, and in fact in these countries, they started to, in the 90s or early 2000 in Germany, they started to do a tax reform, and finally they called it a green tax reform. So people, they accepted more the cost of the reform because we add the environmental issues to it. So maybe it's a good idea to work together, because we saw in these countries that global green tax reform is possible. So that's the fourth reason. There's also a fifth reason. So we see that in these countries, we see that in many countries, many institutions, if we look at the World Bank, at the UN, at the OECD, we have all separate groups dealing with climate change and dealing with international tax reform. We have the top expert dealing with climate change and another top expert dealing with international tax reform. And so they work in their own team, and there's no link, really structured link, so they can work together. And maybe since we have the same problems, we need the consensus, maybe it would be more effective if there's more links between these teams. So since we have the same big problem that we have to deal with. And if we look at this map, so on this map, it's really interesting what we can see. You see this is the world map, and you see that in gray, these are the countries that did not proceed with the international tax reform and did not proceed with climate change initiative or carbon pricing. If you look at the green on the map, these are countries that proceed with both climate change and international tax reform. And if you look at the yellow countries, these countries only proceeded with international tax reform. So you see that there's no country that did not proceed with climate change and international tax reform. So many countries, if they proceed with the climate change, they go ahead with the international tax reform. So we see the interconnection between the two issues, and in fact, if there's many countries, like if we look at Maldives, many small countries that don't want to go ahead with the international tax reform because for many reasons. So these countries, many of these countries, they have climate change issues. So maybe if we group the two initiatives together, we can convince these countries with the climate change issue to go ahead with the international tax reform. So it can be wise to offer to these countries something that can attract them into the international tax reform. So for them to have a green globe, a green minimum tax, maybe would convince them to go ahead with the international tax reform. So for these reasons, we feel that we should at least start discussing about the possibility to take 1% of what is being discussed presently with the global minimum tax and allocate that 1% to climate change. We say that we always have 1% for the good cause, so maybe countries would accept at the end to allow 1% for the climate change in the international tax reform. So this is the first part of the program of the plan we call 1% for the climate, that is dedicated to multinationals. We have another part, and it is asking for the wealthy individual, the top 1%, to pay carbon pricing on their carbon footprint. So why we go ahead, we are suggesting this is basically because presently all the initiative we have, it's more allocated or more dedicated to corporations, to multinational, to the industries, and if we and it's kind of strange because if we look at the studies, we find out that 65% of the carbon emissions are coming from individuals. So, and in that 65%, the extreme majority of these emissions are coming from the very wealthy individuals. In fact, there was a study from Oxfam presented at the COP25, famous one in Paris, that said that the top 1% are producing 175 more emission than the people that are poor. So, and we have the same situation in Canada. So we feel that since these top 1% are emitting most of the carbon in the individuals, we could certainly ask them to pay to pay a tax on their carbon emission, and so they would pay their fair share and be responsible for what they are emitting. So if we do that, we thought one tax on their carbon emission would be possible, because now we have, with the new technology, it's possible to measure your carbon emission or carbon footprint very easily. And also that type of tax would be progressive. That type of tax would not suffer from tax competition. That type of tax would be also would have an information in the sense that the people that are calculating that their carbon footprint would at least know where their emission is coming from, which is not the situation at all presently. So we feel that in order to do the green shift presently, of course we need information, but we need money. So we need money, and we thought to complement the traditional carbon pricing that people are discussing since 30 years, we should start thinking about new tools to fight climate change, new tax tools. And we think that this 1% tax plan to fight climate change is really a useful one. But even if we have the smartest idea, and it is a 10 on 10 idea, we need to consensus, we need to implement these ideas, and in order to do so, I would love to invite my colleague Brigitte Otis, who is an international mediator, the most influential woman that I know, to speak to you about consensus and implementation. Thank you, Judge.
Bonjour, mon nom est Louise Otis, je viens du Québec au Canada. Brigitte Alepin. When we met at McGill University, well, several years ago, you already knew that the redefinition of the taxation system had to surpass state borders. It has to integrate itself in our global economy. An international taxation system that would aggregate funds from the global economy to ensure a more just and equitable redistribution among countries. This was so important to you. And you told me this, you told me more than ever, we will need to know how to negotiate effectively, how to incorporate these instruments of negotiation in our future models. This is where we're really connected. The alarming environmental situation was already quite present, but I would say that the tragedy that awaits our planet makes it a priority now. Funds for the planet now. We are beyond the stage of immediacy. We are actually surpassing the state of emergency, because it is now a question of survival of living species. Whether it is 1% for the planet or fiscal measures targeting big users, we will need to negotiate firmly and plan to use part of this 1% to invest in a massive reconstruction fund to repair the damage that has already begun around the world. An effective reconstruction fund, well managed and well controlled. I would say that in December 2015, the parties convened to an historic agreement, the Paris Agreement on climate. And this resulting on long negotiations to fight against climate change and take actions aiming to reach a future with low intensity of carbon. This agreement, which came into effect in 2016, fixes a global objective to keep the temperature increase below 2 degrees. Although the objectives of nations are voluntary, the countries committed to first, report on their climate policies and their results, second, participate in collective accounts on global efforts. This obligation of transparency is, for me, no doubt about it, it is the strong point of the agreement, because we know now that there's still no international environmental court nor any coercive mechanisms to ensure the nation respect the targets. The Paris Agreement establishes collaboration and cooperation between the signatory countries, so the agreements can only emanate from consensus. Undoubtedly, it is time to change the ways to getting to consensus. 2020 will be unquestionably the most important year for the climate. It will either be the annus horribilis or the year of redemption. We have the choice. The last decade of negotiation produced in 2015 the Paris Agreement, which remains the building block of nations' climate orientation. The COP25 serves one purpose: preparing for the 22 summit in Glasgow, which will be the most decisive since the 2015 summit. And in this context, I take the liberty of considering a few approaches. It will be necessary to accentuate collaboration and cooperation with extraordinary efficacy to create new routes towards a global social contract, maybe the first global social contract. The time has come to include big mediators in the global environmental negotiation. We no longer have the luxury of lengthy face-to-face negotiations of the kind we carry for 20, 30 years. We need to include neutral third parties who are impartial and independent to guide, activate, accelerate negotiations. We need professional mediators who have already conducted hundreds of mediations, mediators who have traveled the limits of the human soul throughout their entire professional life and who know its smallest hidden corners. Those who know how to read hesitation, how to read body language, how to read voice inflection. Those who are skilled at dealing with deadlocks and impasses. One does not become mediator on the spot. It is a profession, and sometimes it's an art. We need to create a team of cutting-edge environmental mediators to tackle the next decades. First, fiscal mediators for reconstructing international taxing towards environmental goals. Second, field mediators assisted by scientists for displaced populations following flooding, disaster, desertification. 3, governance mediators for coordination between states and companies and corporations. This is critical. A solid mobile team that works and moves in real time. A real-time strategy team, right now, immediately. Those you can call during the night and they will be up, and they will be on the job the next morning. Since the end of the 1970s, enlightened by a solid empirical path and nourished with reflections from legal thinkers, we know that mediation recovers a phenomenon in the history of modern law. Mediation constitutes, in appropriate cases, a reconstruction of justice. Let me tell you a story. In 2016, I was invited to the launch of an instrument dedicated to this type of mediation, the Guide of Mediators Faced with Environmental Conflict. Conceived and published by UNEP, United Nations Environmental Programme, this guide is addressed to professional mediators. It describes mediation case studies in countries afflicted by environmental disaster on all the continents. Those type of mediation cannot be improvised, and they need to be conducted by very, very skilled mediators. Given that, I've conducted mediation in environmental conflict in Canada, and I was asked by UNEP to share my own experience in national environmental conflicts in order to highlight the parallel between national and international mediation. We know that the United Nations mediator work in the context of the Charter of the United Nations and resolutions relating to the Security Council and the General Assembly, as well as the Secretary General's bulletins. These normative tools lend legitimacy to the mediation process. What surprised me, however, was when I realized that in the field of environmental conflict, there are common grounds between national and international mediation. You know, we do apply the same mediation techniques, and we prepare our files in the same way. We have evaluation phase, preparatory or pre-mediation phase, and then we conduct the mediation itself, which is a negotiation led by a neutral third party, and finally the implementation phase when we get an agreement. But nevertheless, the UNEP guide reads, and I quote, 2016, they said, despite its promise, mediation has been underused by the international system in addressing disputes over natural resources and environment. The international system still lags behind in acting on opportunities for proactive use of mediation as a tool. And it's 2016. It's time to move on. The time has come to regain the time lost in face-to-face sterile negotiations between opposing parties. We no longer have the time for negotiation based on firm position, diplomacy, and concession that takes months and months. I'm considering, for example, the populations that are currently displaced and that will become displaced over the next year and decades. Climate refugees are now the human face of climate change. Oxfam shows that catastrophes created by climate change were the principal factor of internal displacements over the course of the last decade, forcing about 20 million people per year to leave their homes. The delicate questions of financial and technical aid to support communities, and second, populations relocation in countries and territories, and you know that sometimes they are very hostile to their arrival, call for mediation in real time by experts trained in these issues. You know what? Whether we like it or not, we find ourselves in a big conflict with our planet. We will have to redefine with humility how we live, and we will have to redefine what solidarity and sharing mean in ample measure. We are now irremediably linked for the upcoming decades. Albert Jacquard wrote, I am the places that I weave with others. And you know, in my own society in Quebec, in the Algonquin language, one of the First Nations in Quebec, we have the word Mami do Sewin, and it means let's walk together toward a common destination. And that's what we will have to do. We will have to marcher ensemble vers des espaces sûrs. Merci.